Lena moved quietly between the tables, her steps light, almost invisible, as if she had learned how to exist without being noticed. The restaurant was full that evening, just like most nights. Soft golden lights reflected off polished glassware, and the low hum of conversations mixed with the gentle clinking of cutlery. It was the kind of place where people came to celebrate success, close deals, or simply show that they belonged to a world of comfort and wealth. Lena did not belong to that world. She knew it, and she had accepted it long ago. She adjusted the tray in her hands and approached a table near the window. The guests barely looked at her as she served their drinks. They continued their conversation, talking about business, travel, and plans that sounded far away from anything Lena could imagine for herself. She placed each glass carefully, her movements smooth from years of practice, then stepped back with a polite smile that no one returned. It didn't bother her anymore, at least not the way it used to. There was a time when Lena noticed everything. Every glance, every ignored smile, every careless tone. Back then, it used to hurt. Now, she had learned to focus only on what mattered. Finishing her shift, earning enough tips, and getting through another day. Still, there were moments when something inside her stirred. It usually happened when her eyes drifted toward the corner of the room. The piano stood there, elegant and untouched for most of the evening. Its polished surface reflected the warm lights, and it looked almost out of place, like it was waiting for someone who never came. Sometimes, a hired musician would play during special events, filling the room with soft melodies that made everything feel more alive. But on regular nights like this, it remained silent. Lena always noticed it. She tried not to look too long, but it was hard. The piano was more than just an instrument to her. It was a memory, a piece of a life she had once dreamed of living. Years ago, before everything changed, Lena had spent hours sitting in front of a piano very much like that one. Her fingers had known where to go without thinking. Music had felt natural to her, like breathing. Back then, she believed it would always be part of her life. But life doesn't always follow the plans we make. A voice pulled her back to the present. "Excuse me." Lena turned quickly. A man at a nearby table raised his hand slightly, not looking directly at her. She walked over, keeping her expression calm. "Yes, sir? This isn't what I ordered," he said, pointing at the plate in front of him. "I'm sorry," Lena replied softly. "Let me fix that for you right away." She picked up the plate without argument. Mistakes happened, even when she tried her best to avoid them. What mattered was how quickly she could correct them. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she passed by the piano again. For a brief second, her steps slowed. She remembered the feel of the keys under her fingers, the way the sound filled the room, the way it made people stop and listen. Then she kept walking. Inside the kitchen, everything was louder, faster, more chaotic. Orders were called out, dishes moved quickly, and the air was thick with heat and pressure. Lena handed the plate back to the chef and explained the mistake. He nodded without much interest and started preparing a new dish. Lena waited for a moment, then stepped aside, leaning lightly against the counter. She was tired. The evening had already settled into its usual rhythm when the door opened again. Lena didn't look up right away. She was placing a plate carefully in front of a guest, making sure everything was just right. But she felt it, the slight shift in the room. It wasn't loud or obvious, just a small change in the way people moved and spoke. When she finally glanced toward the entrance, she saw a group walking in together. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The way they carried themselves made space for them without asking. Their clothes were sharp, their posture confident, and their presence seemed to draw attention without effort. Lena lowered her gaze and continued her work. She had seen people like this before. Important guests came and went all the time. For her, it didn't change anything. A table was still a table. An order was still an order. But the manager noticed. He quickly moved toward the group, greeting them with a polite smile that was just a little more careful than usual. His voice softened, his posture straightened, and he led them toward one of the best tables in the restaurant. The one near the center, not far from the piano. Lena picked up a tray of glasses and moved in their direction. As she approached, she could hear parts of their conversation. Low voices, calm, but carrying a sense of control. These were people used to being listened to. She placed the glasses gently on the table, one by one. "Good evening," she said quietly. A few of them nodded. One of them glanced at her briefly before looking away. Another continued speaking without pause. But one man at the table looked directly at her. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, observant. He didn't say anything at first. He simply watched as she finished placing the glasses. Lena kept her movements steady. "Can I get you anything else to start?" she asked. The man leaned back slightly. "Something interesting," he said. It wasn't a clear answer. Lena paused for a second, unsure of what he meant. "Would you like to see the menu?" she asked politely. A faint smile touched his face. "We'll decide," he replied. She nodded and stepped back. As she walked away, she could still feel his gaze for a moment. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was noticeable. She returned to her other tables, continuing her work. Orders were taken, dishes were served, and the evening moved forward. But now, there was a slight tension in the air, something she couldn't fully explain. The new group seemed to carry it with them. Their table quickly became the center of quiet attention. Staff moved more carefully around them. The manager checked in more often than usual. Even the kitchen seemed to prioritize their orders. Lena noticed it all, but she didn't let it slow her down. She stayed focused. Still, every time she passed by their table, she felt that same presence. The man who had looked at her earlier spoke less than the others, but when he did, everyone listened. At one point, laughter rose from their table, louder than the rest of the room. It wasn't wild or uncontrolled, just confident, like they knew they could take up space. Lena approached again with their drinks. She placed each one carefully, her movements smooth and quiet. "Your order will be ready shortly," she said. The man looked at her again. This time, his gaze shifted slightly, moving past her for a moment, toward the piano, then back to her. "You work here long?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. "A while," she replied simply. He nodded, as if that confirmed something in his mind. "You ever play?" he asked. Lena felt her chest tighten just a little. The question came so casually, but it landed heavily. She shook her head slightly. "No," she said. It wasn't exactly true, but it was easier. The man studied her for a moment, then leaned back again. He said quietly. Lena didn't wait for anything else. She gave a small nod and stepped away. Her heart was beating a little faster now. She told herself it didn't matter. It was just a question, but something about it stayed with her. As the night continued, the restaurant grew busier. More guests arrived, filling the remaining tables. The sound of conversation rose again, mixing with the clinking of glasses and the movement of staff. Lena moved through it all, keeping her pace steady. But her thoughts returned to that moment again and again. "You ever play?" She pushed it aside. It wasn't important. Still, she found herself avoiding looking toward that table more than usual. Not out of fear, just to keep her focus clear. Time passed and their food was served. Lena helped bring the dishes out, placing them carefully in front of each guest. The group began eating, their conversation continuing in low, confident tones. For a while, everything felt normal again. Then something changed. It started with a small pause. One of the guests at the table glanced toward the piano. "Strange," he said. "No music tonight?" Another shrugged. "Maybe they don't have anyone," he replied. The man who had spoken to Lena earlier set his fork down. "No music in a place like this?" he said quietly. It wasn't a complaint. It was an observation, but it carried weight. The manager, who had been nearby, stepped closer. "We usually have performances on special evenings," he explained politely. The man nodded slightly. "And tonight isn't special?" he asked. The manager hesitated for just a second. "Of course it is," he said quickly. The man's gaze shifted again, toward the piano, then around the room. Then finally, it landed on Lena. She was standing a short distance away, holding a tray, waiting for the right moment to clear a table. For a brief second, their eyes met, and something in that moment felt different. The man leaned back in his chair. "What about her?" he said. The manager looked confused. "Sir?" he asked. The man gestured lightly in Lena's direction. "She's been looking at that piano all night," he said. "Let her play." The words were simple, but they cut through the room. Lena froze. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had heard correctly. The manager turned toward her, then back to the man. "She's one of our staff," he said carefully. "That's fine," the man replied. "Music is music." A quiet ripple moved through the nearby tables. A few guests glanced over, curious about what was happening. Lena felt the attention begin to shift. Her grip on the tray tightened slightly. The manager stepped closer to her. "Lena," he said in a low voice. She looked at him, her expression uncertain. "I don't," she began. He gave her a small look, one she understood. It wasn't forceful, but it was clear. The man at the table spoke again. "Just something simple," he said. "We're not asking for a concert." A few people nearby smiled lightly, as if it were a harmless request. But for Lena, it didn't feel simple at all. Her heart began to race. The room felt smaller, quieter. Every sound seemed sharper. She shook her head slightly. "I can't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The manager stepped a little closer. "It's just for a moment," he said softly. "It'll be fine." Lena looked at the piano, then back at him, then at the table. The man was still watching her, calm, waiting. Not angry, not impatient, just certain. The room had begun to settle into a new kind of silence. People were watching now, waiting. Lena felt it all. The pressure, the attention, the memory. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't wanted this. But the moment was here now, and it wasn't going away. Her fingers felt cold. Her thoughts rushed. Part of her wanted to walk away, to disappear into the kitchen, into the noise and safety of routine. But another part of her, a quieter part, didn't move. She stood there caught between two choices. The past she had left behind, and the moment standing right in front of her. And slowly, without fully realizing it yet, everything began to change. Lena stood still for a moment after the man's words settled into the room. It felt like everything had paused, even though the restaurant was still full of people. The soft sounds of conversation were still there, but now they seemed distant, like they belonged to somewhere far away. All eyes were slowly turning toward her. She tightened her grip on the tray in her hands, trying to steady herself. Her first instinct was to refuse again. This was not her job. She was here to serve food, not to perform. The piano in the corner felt closer than before, even though she hadn't moved. "I'm sorry, sir," she said carefully, keeping her voice calm. "I don't play anymore." There was a brief silence after she spoke. The man leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her. His expression didn't change much, but there was something firm in the way he looked at her, like he was not used to being told no. "Everyone plays something," he replied. "You don't stand near a piano like that unless you know how." Lena didn't answer right away. She could feel the manager standing somewhere behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know that. The pressure in the air had changed. It wasn't just about one man asking anymore. It felt bigger now, like the whole room was waiting to see what she would do. "I really can't," she said again, this time a little softer. The manager stepped forward then, his voice low but serious. "Lena," he said quietly, "just play something simple." She turned slightly toward him, her eyes searching his face. There was no anger there, but there was expectation. The kind that didn't leave much space for choice. "It's just for a moment," he added. "We can't upset them." Those words stayed in her mind. "We can't upset them." Lena swallowed slowly and looked back toward the table. The group was watching her now, some with curiosity, others with mild amusement. To them, this was probably just a small piece of entertainment, something different to break the routine of their evening. But for Lena, it was something else entirely. Her heart began to beat faster. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Not really. Not in a way that mattered. The thought of sitting there, in front of everyone, made her chest feel tight. I might not remember, she said, almost to herself. That's fine, the man replied. Try. It wasn't really a suggestion. Lena stood there for another second, feeling the weight of the moment. She wanted to walk away. She wanted to disappear into the kitchen, into the safety of routine where no one expected anything more from her. But she also knew that walking away was not that simple. Slowly, she placed the tray down on a nearby counter. Her hands felt cold. Without saying anything else, she turned toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than it should have. The distance between her and the piano was not far, but it felt long. Too long. She could feel people watching her, their attention following every movement. Some guests leaned slightly forward in their seats. Others whispered quietly, wondering what was about to happen. Lena reached the piano and stopped. For a moment, she just stood there. Up close, it looked even more familiar. The smooth surface, the shape, the quiet presence of it. It brought back memories she had tried to forget. Her fingers hovered near the edge, but she didn't touch it yet. She closed her eyes briefly and took a slow breath. Then she pulled out the bench and sat down. The room grew quieter. Not completely silent, but enough that she could feel the change. Conversations had lowered, and the attention in the room had shifted fully toward her. Lena placed her hands on her lap. She didn't look at anyone. Instead, she looked at the keys. Black and white, simple and unchanged, just like she remembered. Her hands slowly lifted and moved forward. For a second, they hovered above the keys. Then she pressed the first note. It was soft, almost too soft to hear in the beginning. Her fingers felt stiff, unsure. The sound that came out didn't match the memory she had in her mind. It felt distant, like something that didn't belong to her anymore. She hesitated. A small pause. From the corner of her eye, she could see a few people shifting in their seats. Someone whispered. Another person let out a quiet breath, as if they were already losing interest. Lena felt a wave of doubt rise inside her. This was a mistake. She shouldn't have agreed. Her fingers moved again, trying to find the next note. But the rhythm wasn't there yet. The connection between her mind and her hands felt broken. She almost stopped. Her shoulders tensed slightly, and for a moment, she thought about standing up and walking away. But then something unexpected happened. A memory surfaced. Not a big one. Not a dramatic moment. Just something small. She remembered sitting at an old piano years ago, in a quiet room with sunlight coming through the window. No audience. No pressure. Just her and the music. She remembered how it felt back then. Not perfect. Just honest. Her fingers relaxed slightly. She pressed another note. Then another. The sound was still simple, still careful, but it began to feel a little more steady. Lena took a deeper breath. She stopped thinking about the people in the room. Stopped thinking about the man who had asked her to play. Stopped thinking about the manager standing behind her. She focused only on the keys. Only on the sound. Her hands began to move a little more naturally now. Slowly, the stiffness faded. The pauses between notes became shorter. The melody started to form, even if it was still quiet and uncertain. The room responded. The whispers faded. The small movements stopped. People who had been distracted before were now paying attention again, though more quietly this time. Lena didn't notice. She kept her eyes on the piano. There were still mistakes. Small ones. Notes that didn't land exactly right. But she didn't let them stop her. She kept going. The more she played, the more something inside her began to shift. It wasn't confidence yet, but it was something close. Her fingers started to remember. Not everything, but enough. The melody grew a little stronger, a little clearer. It was still gentle, still simple, but it carried something deeper now. Something that didn't need to be perfect to be felt. Lena's breathing slowed. Her shoulders dropped slightly. The tension in her hands began to fade. She wasn't playing for the room anymore. She was just playing. For herself. For the part of her that had been quiet for so long. For the part that still remembered what this meant. Around her, the restaurant had changed. The energy was different now. No one was laughing loudly anymore. No one was talking over her. Even the group at the large table had gone quiet. The man who had asked her to play was watching her closely, his expression no longer filled with expectation, but something else, something more thoughtful. But Lena didn't see any of that. She kept playing, slowly finding her way back into something she thought she had lost. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough to keep her going. Lena kept her eyes on the keys, letting her fingers move without forcing them. The early hesitation was still there somewhere in her chest, but it was no longer in control. The sound coming from the piano had begun to settle into something steady, something that felt like it belonged to her again. At first, she had only been trying to get through it, to play something simple and end the moment quickly. But now, something inside her had shifted. The more she played, the less she felt the weight of the room around her. Her fingers pressed the keys with more confidence now. The pauses between notes were no longer filled with doubt. Instead, they felt intentional, like part of the rhythm itself. The melody started to grow. It wasn't loud, but it carried further than before. The soft tune spread across the restaurant, reaching every corner. Conversations had completely faded by now. Even the quiet clinking of glasses had stopped. People were listening, really listening. A man near the window, who had been checking his phone again and again earlier, slowly placed it face down on the table. A couple who had been talking over dessert now sat in silence, their attention fixed on Lena. Even the staff, moving carefully between tables, slowed their steps. There was something in the air that hadn't been there before. Lena could feel it, even without looking up. Her hands began to move more freely, the stiffness from before now almost gone. The music was no longer just a series of notes she was trying to remember. It had started to become something else, something personal. Each note carried a piece of her story, even if no one else knew it. The long hours, the quiet struggles, the dreams she had put aside. It was all there, hidden in the melody. She didn't plan it that way. It just happened. Her breathing matched the rhythm now. Slow, steady, natural. She pressed a sequence of notes that felt familiar, and for a moment, her lips parted slightly in surprise. She hadn't played that part in years, yet her fingers found it without effort. A small spark of confidence lit inside her. Not loud, not overwhelming, but enough. The melody grew richer. It shifted from something simple into something deeper, more layered. The sound filled the room more fully now, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain. Lena's shoulders relaxed further. She wasn't thinking about mistakes anymore. She wasn't thinking about how long it had been. She wasn't thinking about who was watching. She was just playing. In the crowd, the change was clear. At the large table, the group that had first asked her to play had completely quieted down. Their earlier expressions of curiosity and amusement had faded. Now, they were listening with a different kind of focus. The man who had spoken to her earlier leaned slightly forward, his eyes fixed on her hands. The confident air he had carried before was still there, but it had softened. At another table, a woman placed her hand gently over her glass, as if afraid that even a small movement might disturb the moment. Someone else slowly leaned back in their chair, letting the music settle around them. The restaurant no longer felt like a place of noise and movement, felt still. Lena continued, her fingers moving with growing ease. The melody shifted again, rising slightly, carrying a sense of emotion that was hard to explain. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't joy. It was something in between, something real. Her eyes remained on the keys, but her expression had changed. The tightness from before was gone. In its place was a quiet focus, almost peaceful. She moved into another part of the piece, one that required more control. A few hours ago, she wouldn't have even tried it. Now she didn't hesitate. Her fingers flowed over the keys. Smooth, natural, like they had never forgotten. The sound responded immediately, fuller and stronger than before. It reached deeper into the room, wrapping around the silence that had taken over. A quiet breath escaped someone in the audience. Another leaned slightly closer to hear better. No one spoke. No one wanted to break it. Lena could feel the connection now. Not just with the piano, but with something larger. She wasn't playing in front of people. She was sharing something with them, even if she didn't fully realize it. Her hands slowed for a brief moment, softening the melody again. The change was gentle, but it drew everyone in even more. It felt like the music was telling a story, moving through different moments without needing words. And Lena followed it. She let it guide her instead of trying to control it. There were still small imperfections, tiny slips that only someone trained might notice. But they didn't matter. In fact, they made it feel more real, more human. The staff stood quietly along the edges now, watching. Some held trays they had forgotten to move. Others stood near the kitchen entrance, listening without realizing how long they had been there. Even the manager, who had earlier been focused on keeping everything perfect, now stood still, his attention fixed on Lena. He had expected something simple. This was not simple. This was something else entirely. Lena's fingers moved into a softer section again, lowering the intensity but not the emotion. It felt like a pause in the story, a moment to breathe. The room responded. People relaxed slightly, but they didn't look away. They were still there with her. Every note held their attention. Lena felt it now, just faintly, the awareness that she was not alone in this moment. But instead of making her nervous, it gave her strength. Her hands grew steadier, her touch on the keys more certain. She moved into another sequence, one that carried more weight. The notes deepened, creating a fuller sound that filled the space completely. It was no longer background music. It was the center of the room, the reason everything else had stopped. A quiet shift happened inside Lena. For the first time since she sat down, she allowed herself to feel it fully. The connection, the memory, the meaning. Her chest rose with a slow breath, and her fingers responded, pressing the keys with a confidence that hadn't been there before. The melody rose again, stronger this time, clearer, more certain, carried something powerful, something that didn't need explanation. People felt it. They didn't need to know her story to understand that what they were hearing mattered, that it came from somewhere real. Lena didn't rush. She let the music take its time. Each note had space to breathe. Each moment had its place. And as she continued, it became clear that this was no longer just a performance. It was a turning point. She didn't know what would happen after this. She didn't know how the night would end. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the music. And for the first time in years, Lena felt like she had found a part of herself again. A part that had been quiet. A part that had been waiting. And now it was finally being heard. The melody rose higher, and something in the room shifted again. Lena didn't notice it right away. She was still focused on the keys, letting her fingers move in a way that now felt natural, almost effortless. The hesitation that had once slowed her down was gone. In its place was a quiet strength, growing with every note she played. But around her, the change was clear. The silence in the restaurant had deepened. It was no longer just people being curious. It was something more complete, more still. Even the smallest sounds seemed to have disappeared, as if the entire place was holding its breath. At one table, a man who had been speaking loudly earlier now sat completely quiet, his eyes fixed on Lena. At another, someone slowly leaned forward, resting their elbows on the table, drawn in without realizing it. A glass was lifted halfway by a guest, then gently placed back down, forgotten. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. Lena's hands moved into a new part of the piece, one that carried more emotion than anything she had played so far. The notes came out stronger now, fuller but still controlled. It felt like something inside her had opened, something she had kept closed for a long time. She pressed the keys with more feeling. Each note held weight. Each pause had meaning. Her breathing grew deeper, matching the rise and fall of the music. She was no longer thinking about what came next. Her fingers seemed to know on their own. The melody swelled, filling every corner of the room. And this time Lena felt it. Not just the music, but the presence around her. She could sense the silence, the attention, the stillness. It didn't make her nervous. It made her stronger. Her back straightened slightly, and her hands moved with more certainty. The fear that had once followed her was gone, replaced by something calm and steady. She was no longer trying to prove anything. She was simply expressing what she felt. The sound of the piano carried a quiet power now. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it reached deep, touching something inside the people listening. At the large table, the man who had first asked her to play no longer leaned back in his chair. He sat forward now, his expression serious, his eyes locked on her hands. There was no sign of amusement anymore. Only attention. Only focus. He hadn't expected this. No one had. Lena moved into another section, her fingers gliding across the keys with ease. The transitions between notes were smooth, almost effortless. It felt like time had slowed, like everything outside this moment had faded away. The music softened for a brief moment, dipping into something gentle and quiet. It felt like a pause, like a breath before something bigger. The room followed. Everyone stayed still, waiting. And then Lena continued. The melody returned, stronger than before, carrying more depth, more feeling. It wasn't just music anymore. It felt like a story unfolding, one that didn't need words to be understood. Her hands moved faster now, but not rushed. Each movement was clear, controlled, and full of purpose. The notes flowed together, building something that held the room completely. A woman near the center of the restaurant blinked slowly. Her expression softened, as if the music had reached her in a way she didn't expect. Another guest sat with his hands folded, completely still, listening without distraction. Even the staff, who had been trained to keep moving no matter what, had stopped. They stood quietly at the edges, watching Lena, watching someone they thought they knew. But in this moment, she was different. She wasn't just the quiet waitress who moved between tables. She was something else. Something more. Lena felt it too, though not in words. She felt the connection. The way the music moved through her and into the room. The way it held people still. The way it mattered. Her fingers pressed deeper into the keys, drawing out a richer sound. The melody reached its highest point, carrying a quiet intensity that filled the space completely. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Every note seemed to land exactly where it needed to. Every pause felt intentional. The room remained silent, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of attention. Full of feeling. Full of something that didn't need to be explained. Lena's expression remained calm, but there was something new in her eyes now. A quiet confidence. A sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel out of place. She felt exactly where she was meant to be. Her hands began to slow slightly, guiding the melody towards something softer again. The change was gentle, but it carried a sense of closing, like the final pages of a story. The notes became lighter, more delicate, but they didn't lose their meaning. If anything, they felt even more important. The room leaned into the silence between them. No one moved. No one spoke. Even breathing seemed quieter. Lena pressed a final sequence of notes, her fingers moving with complete control. The sound lingered in the air, soft but clear, as if it didn't want to leave. And then, the last note. It hung there for a moment, then faded. Silence. True silence. For a brief second, nothing happened. No one moved. No one reacted. It was as if the room needed time to return to itself. Lena's hands rested lightly on the keys. She didn't lift them right away. Her chest rose slowly as she took a breath, her heart still beating steadily from the moment. She hadn't looked up yet. She wasn't sure what she would see. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the piano. The sound was gone now. Only the quiet remained. And then, somewhere in the room, a soft clap. It was small at first, almost uncertain. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room came alive. Applause filled the space, strong and real. It wasn't polite or forced. It was genuine. People stood from their seats, some clapping louder, others simply watching her with expressions of surprise and respect. Lena looked up. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the faces, the reactions, the attention she had never expected. For a moment, she didn't move. She just sat there, trying to understand what had just happened. The man at the large table stood as well, clapping slowly, his expression thoughtful. There was a new respect in his gaze, something that hadn't been there before. The manager, standing near the side, nodded slightly, his face showing a mix of surprise and pride. Lena felt something rise in her chest. Not fear, not doubt, something warmer, something steady. She stood up slowly from the bench. The applause continued. She didn't bow or make any big gesture. She simply stood there for a moment, then gave a small, quiet nod. It was enough. As the clapping slowly began to fade, the room started to return to its normal rhythm. Conversations picked up again, but softer this time. The energy had changed. Something had happened. Something real. Lena stepped away from the piano. Her legs felt steady. Her mind was clear. As she walked back toward her work, she passed by the tables once again. But this time, people looked at her differently. They noticed her, not just as a waitress, but as someone who had given them something they didn't expect. Something they wouldn't forget. And as Lena picked up her tray again, ready to continue her shift, she carried something with her that hadn't been there before. A quiet belief. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, that part of her life wasn't gone after all. It had just been waiting for the right moment to return. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind did not disappear. Lena stood there for a moment longer, her hands still slightly warm from the keys. The room had returned to its usual movement, but something had changed. It wasn't as loud as before. Conversations had started again, but they carried a softer tone, like people were still holding on to what they had just heard. She stepped away from the piano and walked back toward the service area. Each step felt different from before. The same floor, the same tables, the same lights, but she didn't feel invisible anymore. As she picked up her tray, one of the guests near her table looked up. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. Lena paused for a second, surprised. She gave a small nod. "Thank you," she replied. It was simple, but it felt new. She moved to the next table, expecting everything to go back to normal. But it didn't. Another guest smiled at her as she placed a glass down. Someone else gave her a quiet nod of appreciation. Even those who didn't say anything looked at her differently. They saw her, not just her work. Her. Lena kept moving, doing her job like she always had. But inside, something had shifted. The tired feeling that usually followed her during long shifts felt lighter now. Not gone, but lighter. At the large table, the group was still seated. Their conversation had started again, but it wasn't the same as before. When Lena approached, the man who had asked her to play looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he gave a small nod. "You play well," he said. There was no pressure in his voice this time. No command. Just a simple statement. Lena held his gaze for a second, then nodded back. "Thank you," she said again. He didn't add anything else. He simply returned to his seat, quieter than before. Lena moved on. The rest of her shift continued, but it felt shorter somehow. The hours passed without the usual heaviness. She still worked, still carried trays, still answered requests, but there was a new energy in her steps. The staff noticed it too. In the kitchen, one of the workers smiled at her. "I didn't know you could play like that," he said. Lena gave a small shrug, not sure what to say. "I used to," she replied. He nodded, impressed. "Well, you still can." Those words stayed with her. Later, as the night began to slow down and guests started leaving, the restaurant felt calmer. The lights seemed softer, the noise gentler. Lena wiped down a table near the corner, not far from the piano. She glanced at it again, but this time it didn't feel distant. It didn't feel like something she had lost. It felt close, like something she could reach again. She finished cleaning and stood there for a moment, just looking at it. No one asked her to play now. No one expected anything. The room was quiet. She could have walked away, gone back to her routine, but something inside her didn't want to. Slowly, She walked toward the piano again. Her steps were calm, steady. She sat down on the bench just like before. But this time it was different. There was no pressure, no eyes watching her, no fear of making a mistake. She placed her hands on the keys and played. The sound was soft, gentle, like a quiet conversation. There was no need to impress anyone, no need to prove anything. She just played. For herself. For the first time in years, it felt simple again. The music flowed naturally, without hesitation. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Felt honest. After a few minutes, she stopped. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She sat there for a moment, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Then she stood up and stepped away. The manager had been watching from a distance. He walked over slowly. That was unexpected tonight, he said. Lena looked at him, unsure of what he meant. In a good way, he added quickly. She gave a small smile. I didn't plan it, she said. He nodded. Sometimes those are the best moments, he replied. There was a short pause. You should play more, he said after a moment. Lena hesitated. I don't know, she answered honestly. He didn't push. Just think about it, he said, then walked away. Lena stood there thinking. Play more. The idea felt both exciting and uncertain. She had spent so long believing that part of her life was over, that it belonged to the past, to a different version of herself. But tonight had shown her something else. It wasn't gone. It had just been waiting. As the last guests left and the staff began closing the restaurant, Lena helped finish the final tasks. Chairs were moved, lights dimmed, and the doors were prepared to close. When everything was done, she picked up her bag and headed toward the exit. She paused near the piano one last time. The room was quiet now, empty, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt full of something she couldn't quite explain. She reached out and lightly touched the edge of the piano. Then she smiled, a small, genuine smile, and walked out. Outside, the night air was cool and calm. The streets were quieter than before, with only a few cars passing by. Lena took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. She started walking home, her steps slow but steady. Her mind replayed the night, the moment she was asked to play, the fear, the first note, and everything that followed. Felt real, felt important. For so long, she had thought her story had already been decided, that her path was fixed, simple, and unchanging. But now she wasn't so sure. Maybe there was still more ahead. Maybe there was still time. As she walked, she passed a small shop with a dusty window. Inside, she noticed something familiar. The piano. It wasn't as grand as the one in the restaurant. It looked older, simpler, but it was there. She slowed her steps and stopped for a moment, looking at it through the glass. Her reflection stared back at her. For a second, she imagined herself sitting there, playing again. Not as a dream, but as something possible. She didn't go inside. Not tonight. But she didn't walk away quickly either. After a moment, she took a breath and continued on her way. The road ahead was still uncertain. Nothing had magically changed overnight. She still had work, still had responsibilities, still had a life to manage. But now there was something new, a quiet belief, a small, steady hope. And sometimes that was enough to begin again. Lena walked into the night, not as someone who had lost her path, but as someone who had just found a piece of it again. And this time she wasn't going to let it fade so easily.